Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini. So let's finish this introductory chapter by William Thomas Walsh. He's one of the best English-speaking historians, in my opinion, because he brings out always the role of Freemasonry in history, which, as Brother Sidonius, who was a great historian from Czechoslovakia, I had the privilege to know him at St. Mary's as an old professor there, Brother Sidonius. He said he saw Hitler when he was 9 years old, marching by or something, and he lived through those tumultuous times, and then he was a very good and holy brother, and he ended up helping the society and teaching at the St. Mary's College in his last years, and then he died around 2000, and he's buried at St. Mary's. But he said, you cannot cover any point in history without bringing out Freemasonry. It would not be honest history, he said, if the historian ignores the role of the Masonic lodges, especially in modern history since the French Revolution, because they have had such an influence on decisions and lies and manipulation. And so he's right on that. And that's why I like William Thomas Walsh as a historian. Any of you ever read his book on Queen Isabella, the Catholic? Have you read the Philip II? It's a huge, thick book.
I started it.
Yeah, it's a mountain to climb, but it's worth climbing. It's very good, and he does bring out the role of the Freemasons, Judeo-Freemasonry and all that, and the role of the synagogue of Satan. He doesn't hide all these facts. And then he has a great book called The Inquisition. He has a number of good books, excellent books. So I encourage you to, William Thomas Walsh. All right, so now we left off where he's talking about canonizations and beatification. So the next stage, after being a venerable, is long and complicated. No secular court trying a man for his life is more thorough and scrupulous than the Congregation of Rites in seeking to establish whether or not the servant of God practiced virtues, both theological and cardinal, and to a heroic degree. So that's the key thing in canonizing saints. Their virtue must be heroic, out of the ordinary. If that is established, the advocate of the cause must next prove that his presence in heaven has been indicated by at least 2 miracles, while a cardinal who is an expert theologian does all he can to discredit the evidence. Hence his particular title of Advocatus Diaboli, or devil's advocate. If the evidence survives every attempt to destroy it after months, years, and sometimes centuries of discussion, he is then beatified. That is, he is declared to be blessed. The faithful are permitted but not required to venerate him, to ask him to intercede for them with God. So there's always a devil's advocate to try to disprove that he's a saint, and one who does the research for the canonization. Of course, this is all before Vatican II. So since Vatican II, a lot of this has been tampered with, and they're reckless, and they've changed some of the conditions for sanctity. So with these Vatican II consecrations, with these Vatican II canonizations, we can't just believe all of them. We just can't. When they canonized John Paul II and Paul VI and John the 23rd, who have been destroyers of the church, how can they be saints when they've destroyed the church? Almost destroyed it completely. How's that possible? And then Oscar Romero, and what's that other one? Founder of the Opus Dei.
Jose Maria Escriva.
Jose Escriva, yeah. Canonizing these characters, they want new mass saints, so they have to make these fake saints. So we can't just blindly accept these. But obviously, when Padre Pio is declared a blessed or a saint, or the children of Fatima, most likely they're right. Most likely they're right, because their life was extraordinarily holy. But I pity the good Pope. I pity the good Pope when we get one. Because he's gonna have a lot to clean up. He's gonna just have to bring in the bulldozers and clear out all the rubble and almost start over again. And I think the good God will help him also by a very grave chastisement. The final stage of canonization, the last of 20 distinct steps, may take even more years or centuries. It must be proved beyond any reasonable doubt that 2 additional miracles have been performed through the instance of the servant of God since his beatification. So 2 more miracles for canonization. When and if this is done, the Pope issues a bull, a sealed letter of canonization, in which he not only allows but commands public veneration. Saint Joan of Arc was canonized nearly 500 years after her death. Saint Thomas More, nearly 4 centuries after his. On the other hand, little Saint Therese of the Child Jesus of the Holy Face, who died in 1897, she was beatified in 1923 and canonized in 1925. The spectacle of canonization is, of course, one of the most moving of all the Roman rites. No trouble or expense is spared, and the joy that bursts in music and color at Rome reverberates throughout the whole Christian world. So Archbishop Lefebvre speaks of his going to the canonization of, I think it was St. Bernadette. Yes, he went to the canonization of St. Bernadette of Lourdes. And he describes it as just so beautiful and so powerful, and just Catholic Rome declaring St. Bernadette a saint, and the joy that permeates the whole church. It's quite incredible. There are probably as many saints in the world today as ever before. Almost any person you brush against in a crowd may be one of the chosen ones. And someday your elevator boy or your barber may be canonized. A few years ago, a Dublin truck driver fell dead. It was found that he wore around his body, next to his skin, some heavy chains by way of penance, and had led a life of prayer and mortification, giving most of his meager wages to the poor. Many who claim to have been helped by his prayers are advocating his beatification. Yet one hears a great deal about the progressive de-Christianization of the modern world, on which more than one recent pope has remarked. The fact is generally admitted. If there is a difference of opinion, it has to do with the means by which our unhappy society can be brought back to the following of Christ. In this connection, it may be pertinent to ask, how was it done the first time? Obviously, the task was accomplished principally by saints. It might be useful, and it certainly will be interesting, to examine the lives of some of those magnificent men and women who faced, almost alone, a world more hostile and unbelieving, if possible, than our own. It seemed logical also to begin with St. Peter the Apostle. He has been pretty generally neglected by biographers, yet his life is even more dramatic in some respects than that of the ever-popular St. Paul. He stands nearer to Christ, the master and example of all the saints. He had a more important position in the church and in history, and with his serious weakness of character, he makes a particular appeal to us who are sinners. It was a natural step from St. Peter to the other saints whose stories I have attempted to tell in this book. They carried on his work, each in his own way. Especially is this true of Pope Gregory I, with whom the history of the ancient church may be said to have ended and that of the medieval church began. To those accustomed to think of the Catholic Church as a medieval institution, there may be a bit of a shock in the discovery that during the first 6 centuries of our era, she was essentially as she is today. And the problems of Pope Gregory were remarkably similar in many respects to those of our contemporary Holy Father. Again, he's writing this in the 1940s, and that was under Pius XII. So the title of this book is called Saints in Action. Is not meant to be, in any sense, a concession to the eclectic but essentially materialistic modern mind, which will interest itself in no saint unless he preaches to birds, gets himself shipwrecked, or commands an army. It is true that even in the external sense in which unbelievers understand action, the lives of saints are more exciting, more varied on the whole than those of most other persons. It was not by chance that St. Cosmas became the patron of barbers, doctors, and dentists, fiacre of chauffeurs and coachmen, St. Dismas, the patron of those condemned to death, St. Hubert, patron of dogs and hunters, St. Walston, patron of farmers, St. Andrew of fishermen and sufferers from gout, St. Eusebius, patron of horses, St. Louis of horse traders, St. Eligius of jewelers, St. Anne, patroness of housewives, St. Barbara, patroness of impenitent sinners, King David, patron of musicians and poets, St. Peter of Alcantara, of night watchmen, St. Agatha, patroness of nurses, St. Nicholas of pawnbrokers, or antique dealers, we would say, St. Zita of servant girls, St. Thomas Aquinas, patron of students, St. Hilary, patron of snakes, Job, patron of syphilis, St. Clarus, patron of tailors. But it is a common mistake to suppose that action consists only of outward activity. The greatest action of which a human being is capable is contemplative prayer. Contemplative prayer. Try convincing most men of that. The greatest action you and I can do is contemplate God. What are you talking about? What are you doing? What are you building? Well, you're contemplating God. Yeah, but what are you doing? Are you making any money? Are you building anything? Where's the measurements? Where's the progress I can measure? Well, you can't measure progress in contemplative prayer, can you? But this is the way of the saints. That's why Pope Leo XIII had to write in his encyclical condemning Americanism the idea that the only virtues are external virtues. That's false. That's why America, more than any other country, and Canada, need contemplative orders. Contemplative nuns, contemplative monks, priests who are contemplatives, and nuns who are contemplatives. St. John Bosco was busy as ever could be, running a whole huge school of boys, and also a seminary at the same time, plus a trade school, plus taking care of other parishes, hearing confessions, helping other priests, plus going to the prisons to visit the prisoners. Yet St. John Bosco worked many miracles. He was always a contemplative. Because, even in his busy life, he was always united with God. Even in his sleep, he had these dreams of the angels and God speaking to him. So contemplative prayer is conversation with God, the silent activity of Mary, in contrast with the bustle of St. Martha. There is not and cannot be, now he's quoting here, Saint Teresa of Avila from Interior Castle, chapter 4, book 7. This is Saint Teresa of Avila. She said, "This is what prayer is for, my daughters. This is what the spiritual matrimony is for. To bring forth always works. That is, good works. There is not and cannot be a virtue that is really passive," said Pope Leo XIII. "Catholic mysticism almost invariably bears the fruit of great external actions as well. The meditations of St. Paul, as St. Teresa of Avila noted, found their expression in dramatic toil. This is what prayer is for, my daughters," she said. "This is what the spiritual matrimony is for, to bring forth always works. So think of Blessed Charles de Foucauld, who lived as a hermit among the Muslims. He never converted one Muslim in his life, but he fasted and prayed for their conversion. And I think the fruits of Blessed Charles Foucauld is for our time, because many Muslims now are converting to the Catholic Church. Many are. And our Lord is appearing to many Muslims, drawing them to the Catholic faith. So I think those are the fruits of Blessed Charles de Foucauld, who gave his whole life to convert them, but never saw one baptism in his life of a Muslim. Here then is some account of the principal works of several saints, from St. Peter to St. Gregory the Great, each of whom played some important part in the extension of the Catholic faith throughout the whole world and affecting even our own world, and how our pusillanimous age needs their fearless voices. What's pusillanimous? Our pusillanimous age, our tender-footed, our wimpish age, our effeminate age. We need to hear these voices. So that's why we're going to dive into this. So let's start with St. Peter. We've already seen St. Athanasius in detail. So let's go right back to the first pope, St. Peter the Apostle. You shall fish after men. 20 centuries have greatly changed the aspect of the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias, the Lake of Gennesareth. The sweet waters still lie smooth, clear, and deep at the bottom of the gorge of the River Jordan, nearly 700 feet below the level of the Mediterranean Sea, and fish breed in them faster than anywhere else in the world. Today, as then, a furious gust from a deep ravine will occasionally whip the surface into a wild tumult and die away just as suddenly, leaving it calm and glassy as before. Yet where the barren shores now speak of a cheerless desolation, lusty voices used to resound on the cluttered wharves of 9 or 10 cities, teeming with life, thriving with the traffic of many lands. Day after day, along its whole length of 13 miles, the lake would be streaked with the white sails of hundreds of fishing boats, each of which might drag in its nets as many as 600 pounds in a single catch. Most of it to be exported to all parts of the Roman world. So we're stepping right in here to St. Peter's world. He grew up on the Sea of Galilee. And as a little boy, he would have grown up as a fisherman with probably his father. So he knew how to read the waves, read the storms, read even, I know some fishermen who can read the waters and know where the fish are. Isn't that amazing? They just read the waters like a book. The homes of a vital people ended in fields so fertile and so blessed with sun and water that 2 annual harvests were nothing unusual, and grapes and figs grew 10 out of the 12 months. It was in that country, checkered with incredible corn patches and olive groves, that Asher dipped his foot in oil, Deuteronomy 33:24. Beyond the fields arose thick and lordly forests, extending to the peaks of high mountains on the east and lower, more broken ones on the west. There the brittle cry of the axe announced a growing population, new faces, new homes. Now all that life has vanished. Of the confused ruins of Capharnaum, nothing is recognizable but the supposed walls of a hallowed white synagogue. Of other cities, not even a stone remains. Of some, no one can say just what they were. So the archaeologists, now they have all these videos on this that you can see, and it's very interesting, some of them. Capharnaum there's a modern city of Capharnaum, but there's the old Capharnaum where our Lord walked and worked miracles. And that synagogue is still there. And you can see the seaside that our Lord would have crossed on foot and by boat. And it's always sunny over there, of course. It's kind of like California weather, really. It's quite beautiful. It is a fact of history, however, that in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, a certain Hebrew named Jonas was one of those who earned a good living hauling fish from the deep lake to the markets of Capharnaum. So Simon, son of Jonas. Almost nothing else is known of him except that he had two sons, Andrew and Simon, and that Simon, with whom we are here concerned, was the child of no common destiny. Their home, the fishing house, was in Bethsaida, Bethsaida, Bethsaida. That's St. Peter's home. Bethsaida. Let me just finish this paragraph. Their home was in Bethsaida, the market and port of the town of Capharnaum, on the north bank of the lake. It was probably a comfortable home, for Jonas and his sons had a large vessel and must have found it profitable to send their commodities to the Roman garrisons, to the Jewish magnates of Jericho or Jerusalem, far to the south, to the rich invalids who sought health at the springs of Tiberias, and smoked or dried fish to Rome and Alexandria. So we'll pick up with the adventurous life of St. Peter. So he writes so well, William Thomas Walsh. So we'll pick up there. Adjutorem nostrum in nomine Domini.